Yeah, the testing idea wasn't my idea. Right? So, as far as getting close to nature on Sabbath, I studied poison oak a little too closely. Anyway, brilliant and beautiful but wrong. So a lot of people consider the theory of evolution beautiful in the sense that of a scientific theory explaining a lot. And when you first look at it superficially, it makes a lot of sense. Well, this happens, there's all these different kinds of finches, and there's different kinds of lizards and cats and dogs, and they mutate and they change shape and color and all these things. It makes a lot of sense when you look at it initially or superficially, and that's what worried me when I first started looking at this question. I was like, it does make a lot of sense as a scientific theory initially, because it looks like it explains a great deal. But it doesn't explain things as you look at it more and more detail. The devil is in the detail, if you want to say it that way. Isaac Newton was is one of my favorite scientists, because he actually wrote more about religion than he did about science. And he's considered the father of modern scientific investigation, modern scientific thought, and mathematics. So he was a true genius, an amazing person. And a little bit arrogant, but he kind of deserved to be, I guess. But he's only arrogant relative to other people. Relative to God, he was actually quite humble. So this is what he said. He said, "He who thinks half-heartedly will not believe in God." If you approach the problem half-heartedly or superficially, you can come away with the idea that there's no God. But he who really thinks has to believe in God, right? In the absence of any other proof, the thumb alone would convince me of God's existence. And this is someone who really thought about small things like a thumb, right? He thought about minute details, and his own thumb was really impressive to him. So, again, the whole system of the sun, planets, and comets could only have come from an intelligent and powerful being, according to Newton. He said, but this is where he gets humble. He says, "I do not know what I may appear to the world." Well, he had a pretty good idea. "But to myself, I seem to have been only like a boy, playing on the seashore, and diverting myself, and now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before me." So this is what I think that we should strive to be as Christians, is to consider this advice from Peter. He said, "Always be prepared to give a defense to everyone who asks you the reason for the hope that is in you, but respond with gentleness and respect." And it actually has to be a reason. Like when you're a kid and you ask your parents, "Well, why mama? Why daddy?" And they just said, "Well, because I said so." Anybody get that? Well, I used to ask the why question a whole lot, and eventually my parents would just get frustrated. But because I said so is not explanatory. It has no explanatory value, right? So when someone comes up to you and asks you, "Why do you believe?" What gives you hope in God and confidence in the future? You have to come up with something that will resonate with them besides "I said so" or "because I have faith." Saying "because I have faith" is not good enough. Why do you have faith? What is the basis for it? What is the reason for your faith? And so that's what I'm trying to do here. What is the reason for my faith? So Richard Feynman, to talk about what a lot of people think about the difference between science and faith, said religion is a culture of faith. Science is a culture of doubt, right? And for a lot of people who view faith as blind faith, this is the definition of faith. But Christian faith, at least biblical faith, is not described this way in the Bible. For example, Hebrews 11 defines it this way. Paul defines it this way. "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for. It's not ethereal. It has substance. The evidence of things not seen." So what evidence do you have for the things that are not seen? For teenagers at least, faith is like Wi-Fi, right? You can't see it, you can't touch it, but you can't live without it. And so, also the disciples, they didn't have blind faith. In fact, when Jesus was first killed on the cross, the disciples were completely scared to death They were chicken-hearted, chicken-livered. They weren't brave, standing for truth. God's going to save us. None of that. They had no faith whatsoever, right? They were hiding in the upper room with the doors locked. Anybody kind of sneeze, ouch, right? They were terrified, right? What made them brave? What gave them faith? No Bible study. What made them brave is actually seeing the resurrected Christ for themselves. The evidence of the resurrection made them invincible. They were now fearless after that, right? But it was evidence, physical, empirical evidence that convinced them that God was real, that Jesus really was the Messiah, and that he really was the Son of God. Without the resurrection, they had nothing, right? And Anthony Flew, he actually started out as a famous atheist in Britain, and then he became convinced that there was some kind of God somewhere, and he became a deist, but never became a Christian. But he was close because of the resurrection. And there's a lot of evidence for the resurrection outside the Bible, by the way. It said, the evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity, right? So if you have 12 guys, plus a lot of other hundreds of people who saw him dead, and they said, no, he's alive. All you have to do is present the body, right? And who in their right mind, especially 12 chicken-livered guys, would put their lives on the line? They all died martyrs' deaths for something they knew was a lie, right? No one does it. No one puts themselves on the line, gets boiled in oil, and has their skin ripped off of them, and all these things they died of, for something they knew was a lie. They actually believed they saw the resurrected Christ, right? That's pretty clear, even outside of the Bible. There's all these historical documents outside of the Bible. Except for John, they tried to boil him in oil, but he wouldn't boil. He was just like, woo-doo-doo-doo-doo. So they sent him off to an island, and he died natural death. Everybody else, though, was actually martyred for their faith. So I like this quote from Galileo, because I think that God made science. Any true science is a gift of God. Scientific thinking, the ability to think rationally, all these things are a gift of God, and we should use them. You should use these gifts. He says, I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use and just say, well, I believe in blind faith. Right? So what is science? We already talked about it earlier. It's just basically the use of past events to predict the future in a way that's testable where you can be wrong. Okay, potentially falsifiable. Science is not limited in its ability to detect the existence of the miraculous, as we talked about this morning. Only it's an ability to explain the miraculous. And for me, it's kind of like women. I know women exist, and they're miraculous. I just can't always explain them, but I know they exist. Right? And even scientists sometimes, they make all their formulas, and then in the middle of all their formulas, it says, then a miracle occurs. It says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. Well, just last night, I was watching a program on the universe, and there's this stuff called dark matter, right? You know, the stuff that we can actually see and touch, the chairs and everything, the stars that we actually can see, it's 0.1% of the universe, mass of the universe, right? Everything else is dark matter. So what is dark matter? No one knows, right? You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't smell it. Only thing you can do is detect its gravity. That's it, right? Yet they believe that it exists because of all the evidence for the gravitational effects, right? But they have faith. They can't see it, they can't touch it. It's like Wi-Fi for them. It's like their teenage Wi-Fi. But it's a miracle in a way. I mean, they can't explain how it works, how it does any of this stuff. It's just they know it exists because of what it does to things around it, right? That's why they believe that dark matter exists. So how does the Bible describe evidence for God? You know, let's at least start with what the Bible describes as evidence, as credible evidence. We already talked about the resurrection. That's really good. Scientific type evidence, empirical evidence. You can touch it. He ate with them. He talked with them. All these things, flesh and bones, put their finger in the side. All these things are scientific tests, right? There's also this test described in the Bible, scientific test. Elijah said, hey, you guys, you build your altar and put your bull on there and the wood and everything, and then you pray to your God Baal, and I'll pray to mine, and we'll see who answers with fire. He put water on his too, Elijah. And they pray all day long, nothing happens. Then Elijah, at the end of the day, he says a simple, short prayer, and zoom, all the sacrifice is gone. The rocks, the water, everything destroyed. I've actually had friends of mine tell me that this was perhaps an accidental lightning strike. Right? So it's like, come on. First of all, it hadn't rained for 3 years. There was no cloud in the sky. And if the lightning happened to happen, it happened exactly at the right spot, at the right time, exactly on cue, right? Come on, you got to be desperate before you can believe that sort of thing, right? So, but the thing about it is that the Bible says, look, we can describe this all day long to you, but you have to try it out for yourself. You have to do your own tests. Test it out for yourself and see if it's good. So the Bible describes some of the things you can do, like pay your tithes and offerings. Do an experiment, a scientific experiment, because God says no strings attached. I don't care if you're good, bad, or ugly, or good looking, or whatever. No strings attached. If you pay your tithes and offerings back to God, because the human heart is so closely attached to money, right? So if you give back a little bit of it, God takes notice, right? It says, I don't care why you did it. I'm going to give you a blessing, right? And you can test it and see if God will hold up his word or not. And it's something I challenge you to do. I've actually done it myself. I wouldn't recommend actually not doing it because it doesn't work out well. But when you do it, you notice a difference. I certainly have. And you can try it out for yourself and see if you don't notice a difference. It's not necessarily monetary either. You'll notice a difference in some part of your life. There's also prayer. You can test prayer and see if God's a personal God, interacts with you personally. And I have to cut so many things out of these lectures. These lectures are like a tenth of what I actually started out with. Anyway, this is Wesley's pocket knife in my hand, my oldest son, Wesley. We went walking through the woods to go see a waterfall that was like 5 miles one way. I don't know why we did that. But by the time we got headed back to where we parked the car, it was getting sort of dark, and we were off trails. We were just walking through trees and grass and off-roading, right? And then Wesley comes up to me, and he's 10 years old at this point, and he says, I lost my pocket knife. I was like, well, bummer. You're going to have to buy another one with your own money, right? Let this be a lesson to you. Of course, his mother's more tender-hearted than I am, and she says, well, maybe we could pray for it. And I was like, that could turn out bad, right? Of course, I'm head elder, so I can't say that out loud. But I was like, come on. And so I kind of walk up ahead, and she does it by herself. She stops, closes her eyes, and says, come on, God, this could be a really teaching thing for Wesley. It's like, we need to pray for this. And so she prayed, please, if you're going to show it to me, it has to be, when I open my eyes, it has to be right in front of me because it's getting dark and we're in the middle of nowhere and I don't know where to even begin to look for it. There's hundreds of acres that we went through. And so she says this prayer and she opens her eyes and she looks down and it's right in front of her on the ground, right? And you can say, well, she just got lucky, right? Or you can say, the angels were really excited just to be waiting for that prayer to just place it there, right? And so I was like, that's what I believe. And because the odds, what are the odds? And then she picks it, look, it's here. I was like almost passed out. Then Bradley, of course, my younger boy, he was about 8 years old at this time. We went to Maui, and all these miracles are happening to Wesley and everything. And Bradley gets disturbed. First of all, everybody else got to see a sea turtle and sharks and things, and he didn't. So for evening worship that one time, he prayed, tomorrow I want to see the turtles, right? And so we went back out. Sure, there's Bradley with his goggles. Love the goggles. Sure enough, while we were out there, a sea turtle came swimming right by him. We touched him as he went by. And then he got bowled over by a wave and knocked off his goggles. And these goggles don't float. They look pretty solid. Anyway, they don't float. And so they got knocked off and it's all churned up. There's no way you can find these things. And so he stands up. He doesn't ask, no one asks me anymore. He just starts praying himself, dear God, he's like 3 feet away from me. Please give me my goggles back, right? immediately, amen, the goggles pop up to the surface. It's like that floating axe head, right? He picks them up, puts them on, thank you, then dives back in. You just got to try it for yourself. This is the more personal for me, is that Wesley, my youngest, was diagnosed with Crohn's disease when he was 4 years old. And he was really sick. He almost died. His hemoglobin dropped in half. His platelets were over 1 million, C-reactive protein sky high, and his colon looked like hamburger. And it took me a while. Sigurd's family has Crohn's disease history, but he didn't have all the classic symptoms. He started out with painful nodules under his skin. He didn't really have very much abdominal pain. And so I missed it for like 9 months. We could not figure it out. The pediatricians couldn't figure it out, surgeons. And finally he had some perianal abscesses twice, and so that's when we decided to do the colonoscopy and found out he had Crohn's disease. So we prayed for him, and we even took him to get anointed at the church, and nothing happened. He was not healed. And then the next day, a crazy dermatologist friend of mine, who I thought was kind of eccentric, he shows up and he says, hey, like out of the blue, he didn't even know what we were going through. He says, have you ever considered thinking about vitamin D for your children and even for yourself? Because vitamin D helps with autoimmune disorders. Helps even reverse multiple sclerosis and even some of the skin diseases that he deals with that are autoimmune, like epidermolysis bullosa. It helps people resolve from that. And I thought he was nuts. It's like vitamin D. You're like one of these vitamin C, vitamin people, right? And so I was like, no. So at least he's a dermatologist, so I decided to go look it up. Just the previous month, a paper had been published on vitamin D and Crohn's disease with children. And then another paper I found had been on a type of fast, a liquid-only diet, a Pediasure diet for 12 weeks. Only been done with adults, never with a child. So I took him to, Wesley was going to the #1 childhood Crohn's specialist in the world at that point at UC Davis. And so I asked him about these things, like, can we do this liquid-only diet thing? He said, no, he has to go on these heavy-duty immune suppressive drugs and steroids and things like that in order to get him under control. And then he has to stay on this for the rest of his life. Well, I'm a pathologist, and I know a little too much about some of these drugs. I've diagnosed, these drugs have a 1 in 40,000 chance per year of lethal lymphoma for the particular drug that is common for Crohn's disease treatment. And 1 in 40,000 doesn't sound a lot unless it's your child, per year. In 10 years, that's 1 in 4,000, right? So I'm doing all these calculations in my mind. I've diagnosed it 3 times for people in their 20s who've died of this. Right? There's no treatment. Once you get it, you're dead. And so it's like, well, if I have to do it, I have to, right? There's no, either he's dead now or he's dead later, right? There's no choice. I was like, but I would like to try this diet thing and the vitamin D and all that stuff first. He says, well, since you're a pathologist, professional courtesy or whatever, you can go ahead and try it, but you'll be back in a couple weeks and then we'll go from there. So we went and tried it, and it was terrible. It was really hard because Wesley, it took him like an hour to drink 6 ounces. The first day it's chocolate milk, right? So oh, that's great, right? Second day, he refused to drink it. He was only 4, right? And he had to drink 6 of these things a day. So it was tough. And so finally, I taught him how to guzzle. And he was able to do it in 10 seconds. And that sped things up pretty good. And so it started working, and things started improving a bit. And so we continued on. We didn't go back at 2 weeks. He started getting better. And then at 12 weeks, we went back and had another colonoscopy. This was another one of his hamburger ones. And his colonoscopy was perfectly normal. And the doctor told me, the Crohn's specialist said, well, the biopsy will have some inflammation. But his labs had all normalized, except the C-reactive protein was still slightly high. And biopsy came back normal. And Wesley has been in remission ever since. And usually you get 2 or 3 flare-ups a year from this. And papers have been written about Wesley, and it's gone around the world. Thousands of children have been helped by this now. So for me, I was like, leave it up to God sometimes. You don't demand a miracle, right? What you do is you say, God, when you anoint somebody, you put them in God's hands, right? You say, miracle or no miracle, we just want to put them in your hands. and let you do the best that you want with them, right? And so which is the better miracle, that Wesley ended up finding a solution for somebody besides just himself, or for just himself, right? Like if he instantly healed, what would happen to all these other kids with Crohn's disease, right? So leave it up to God. But miracles happen if you just put yourself in God's hands. And also be specific in your prayers. It's okay for God to say no. God says no a lot, right? But if you're not specific in your prayers, you're not going to see them answered, right? But just because God says no doesn't mean that the yeses, when he says yes, aren't very clear that they're still divine in answers. What's cool too is the miraculous nature of the 7-day week. You know, there's all these cycles. There's light and day cycles, there's daily rhythms, there's monthly rhythms, there's yearly rhythms where the earth goes around the sun once a year, all these rhythms. But there's no natural basis for a 7-day week, right? At least there used to not be. It was about 6 or 7 years ago where it turned out that the 7-day week, because they used to be thought that the 7-day week was invented by the Babylonians, which doesn't make sense. The Babylonians had a base 60 system, not a 7 system, right? So that doesn't make any sense that it was invented by the Babylonians and then inherited by the Jews, who then wrote it down during the Maccabean era or whatever in the Bible. That's what the critics say happened. But what has been discovered is that every single living thing that has been studied has a fundamental 7-day biorhythm, the septicircadian rhythm. Every cell in your body functions on a 7-day rhythm. That's why antibiotics are given for 7 days, because they work better on a 7-day cycle, right? Even the enamel in your teeth is modified on a 7-day cycle. And there's even some Brazilian bees that actually don't work on Sabbath, and it actually happens to be today in Brazil. And they just stay in their hive and hang out. And they don't go collect honey or anything. And then they rest, and then on the Sunday morning, they're out busy collecting honey again. So every living thing that has been studied in any detail have a 7-day biorhythm. And so if you don't live by the 7-day biorhythm, animals and plants don't do as well. They don't live as long. They're not as healthy. And so maybe it plays over into humans as well. If we humans don't observe what we were designed and created to observe, a 7-day biorhythm, we won't be as healthy either. And you know that Seventh-day Adventists are the longest lived ethnically diverse people in the world? And it's not just because of our diet. Other people have similar diets too. And certainly it's not because of genetics, because we're ethnically diverse. It's called blue zone people. This is me and my mother and my grandmother, who's 101 there, and Wesley and Bradley. And, they went and studied these. The National Geographic has written about this. Oprah Winfrey has done a show about this. And part of it is that we take 1 day a week off, and we devote it to God. And, the Bible also says there's a specific blessing if you take the actual 7th day off, that God adds a blessing to it. You can test it and see. And why are we the longest lived ethnically diverse people in the world? There's a lot of factors involved, and maybe this is one of them. Also prophecy. Peter said, look, guys, we were there. We saw the Messiah. We talked with him. We lived with him. We ate with him. We touched. We were there. We did all that. And we even saw the resurrection, right? We saw the evidence of the resurrection. But he says, you guys don't have that. But there's something that you guys have that's better than everything that I saw and touched and felt in real life. And that's prophecy. He says the prophecy is a more sure word than my own personal experience. You can go and analyze the Bible and test it scientifically to see if it happened. And for one example, the famous statue in Daniel of the image of Nebuchadnezzar, and just see if it didn't happen in history. The head of gold is Babylon, chest of silver, Medo-Persia, belly and thighs of bronze is Greece, legs of iron, Rome. And Daniel actually named some of these. It's not like you have to assume what they are. It's actually named by the angel in Daniel, except for Rome. So, and then there's animals that reflect exactly the same thing in Daniel, so you're not confused by it. And there's this little horn. Talk about that in a minute. And so do they add up? A winged lion, Neo-Babylon, lopsided bear, Medo-Persia, four-headed leopard, Greece. And it's a leopard with 4 wings, because Alexander conquered the then known world, the Persian Empire and everything else, in extreme speed, really, really fast. And so that's why the wings and the leopard. And the 4 heads is because it divided into 4 parts. Same with the horn later on. 10-horned beast with iron teeth. Again, you got the iron of Rome again. And then Daniel predicts that at the end of time, the iron and clay will not mix together. And this has been used prophetically in modern times, like Hitler is not going to take over Europe because of this prophecy. This was used during the time and said, Hitler's lost the war before he's even started because of this prophecy. And it was prophesied all along. Same thing for Napoleon. In fact, Napoleon got angry with the Bible prophecy. And he said, when he was defeated in Russia, he said, God is too much for me. Right? Because the prophecy said these people would not cleave together, even if they tried to make marriage alliances with each other. So there's also Nebuchadnezzar, the story of Nebuchadnezzar himself. It used to be thought that Nebuchadnezzar, by the biblical critics, was a minor king at best, that he did not build Babylon. He was certainly not the primary builder. The primary builder was an Assyrian queen known as Queen Semiramis. And all this information was taken from the Greeks, who are the ones who promoted this idea for a long time. And also Belshazzar was completely made up by the Bible, completely fictional. He never existed because there was no extra biblical description of him. There was no sources outside of the Bible to describe Belshazzar at all. And so the Bible just made up all these things. That was until they started finding these cuneiform tablets describing Belshazzar, the whole situation with the water being deferred and how Babylon was taken over, marching under the gates, exactly like the Bible describes it, right? And so all of a sudden he exists. And also Nebuchadnezzar describing his work on the temple of his sun god in Babylon. And what's really cool, and it turns out Queen Semiramis didn't have anything to do with the building of Babylon or the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. How do we know? Because when Babylon was actually discovered, the actual city of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's name is printed on every brick, right? You wouldn't think Semiramis would do that for him. So anyway, I talked about Belshazzar already. His name is also on this tablet that was found exactly exactly as described in the Bible. Also, the farther back you go, the Ebla tablets talk about the Noah's flood and how many people survived and all those things. The farther back you go with these tablets, the more similar to the Bible they become. So the information is lost over time except by the Bible, right? The Bible's maintained as the most accurate archaeological textbook in the world. They speak of a flood. The Ebla tablets, they mention names of Abraham, Isaac, and suggest names known that they were common during that time. They talk about Sodom and Gomorrah and all the 5 cities in the valley in the same order of the Bible. And this is in the face during the time where the higher critics said that Sodom and Gomorrah, Ur, and the Canaanite cities were all made up. They never actually existed until these tablets were discovered. So the past, if you're using this as a scientific prediction, you're saying, well, all these things happened in the past. Well, the main point I'm trying to make here is that no one could have known. The argument is that Daniel was written after all the prophecies because the prophecies are too specific, right? So they had to be written after all these kingdoms happened during the Maccabean period. That's when the book of Daniel was written, according to the biblical critics. Well, the book of Daniel could not have been written during that time because all the information was lost during that time. Anybody who wrote the book of Daniel during the Maccabean period would have said Semiramis built Babylon, and that Belshazzar they wouldn't have mentioned the name Belshazzar because they would not have known about him. All that information was lost. So only someone living during the time in Nebuchadnezzar, during 600 BC, could have actually written the book of Daniel. So that means the prophecies are credible, scientifically credible, regardless about what the critics say. And so it also gives us hope that when Daniel says a stone is cut out without hands and it destroys all the kingdoms and the kingdom of God fills the whole earth and takes over everything, that's going to happen, right? You can have confidence that that's going to happen. So what was it about Darwin? Most scientists, the best scientists in the world, most of them, were Christian before Darwin came along. So then Darwin came along and it kind of changed everything. So what happened with Darwin? Well, Darwin, it wasn't so much, he didn't, he started out kind of as a religious person, but then he got disturbed with God because he saw all the evil in the world. And he was so disturbed, he could not merge the idea of a good God with an evil world. And it really upset him that a cat should play with mice, or that wasps should lay eggs in caterpillars so that eat them from the inside out. And what really upset him is the loss of his favorite daughter, Annie, who died of a scarlet fever. And that really, really upset him. And so he kind of tried to distance himself from this idea of God. He probably remained a bit agnostic, but mostly atheistic in his thinking because of these things. And so the implications of what Darwin presented, the Darwinian theory, has serious implications for religion, at least rational religion. William Pervine summarized the implications of Darwinian evolution. He said, if you believe in Darwinian evolution and you're honest with yourself, you can't really be a Christian, because no gods worth having exist. No life after death exists, at least nothing that you can be solid about. No ultimate foundation for ethics exists. No ultimate meaning in life exists, and human free will is non-existent. And Darwin understood these things perfectly well, the implications of his own theory. In other words, religion is compatible with modern evolutionary biology and indeed all of modern science if religion is effectively indistinguishable from atheism. In other words, you have no evidence that's effective that will distinguish your religion from atheism. Or do we? Einstein got a letter from a little girl asking him about prayer, what he thought about prayer. He said, scientific research is based on the idea that everything takes place is determined by the laws of nature. For this reason, a research scientist will hardly be inclined to believe that events could be influenced by a prayer, i.e. by a wish addressed to a supernatural being. So he did not believe in a personal God at all. And so that was true for a lot of modern scientists after Darwin, until very recently, where some scientists, even some really prominent ones, and philosophers are starting to question Darwinism. And this is an interesting review by David Gerlitner, professor at Yale, computer science, and chief scientist at the Mirror Worlds Technology and the National Council of Arts. He's very well known in his cultural, political, and historical reflections. And he wrote a shocking review. It really caused a stir in 2019 in the scientific community. He said, evolution is beauty, is important. Beauty is often a telltale sign of truth. Beauty is our guide to the intellectual universe, walking beside us through the uncharted wilderness, pointing us in the right direction, keeping us on track most of the time. And Darwin's main problem, however, is molecular biology. There was no such thing in his own time. We now see from inside what he could only see from the outside, as if he had developed a theory of mobile phone evolution without knowing that there were computers and software inside, or what the digital revolution was all about. He was only looking on the outside of the cell phone. Neo-Darwinism says that nature simply rolls the dice, and if something useful emerges, great. Otherwise, try again. But useful sequences are so gigantically rare, as we talked about this morning, that this answer simply won't work. It's an exponential problem. Darwin would easily have understood that minor mutations are common, but can't create significant evolutionary change. Major mutations are rare and they're fatal, almost always. So it's a beautiful theory as far as science goes, but it's wrong if you look at the details. It's like Newton said, if you look at it superficially, it's beautiful as far as science goes. But if you actually think about it, it's wrong. So it's the same thing. One little drop of poison can make a beautiful theory totally destroyed. See, one little fact, some people have called it an annoying fact, can destroy a beautiful theory. A single annoying fact, right? So what are the facts? And it's the same thing that Satan tries to do with everything that's good. So he said, your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you out to the earth. I made you a spectacle before kings. And he's been trying to do it all along, trying to add just a little bit of poison to something that looks plausible, right? He does this all the time. So let me explain why it doesn't work. Evolution that isn't. This is what Darwin was looking at the cell phone from the outside. He saw all these changes. He saw different kinds of moths, different kinds of dogs and cats and birds and flowers and peas. And he said, well, little changes over time can add up, clearly. Right? So these are evolutionary examples in real life. So all these different finches came from the same parental finch group, and that made all these different kinds of finches. Different colors, different sizes of beaks, different strengths, different weaknesses. All these things happen from the same parental gene pool. And so here, evolution in action, it became famous. So slight variation, if useful, is preserved, and it's termed, and this is what he described it, he called it natural selection. So natural selection selects out those things that are useful and it discards the rest, and you make changes over time in this way. And he drew a little picture of it, and it turns into a tree, very famous drawing in his book, that you can have an evolutionary tree of life. And this is kind of a more detailed drawing of Darwin's tree, where it just kind of branches from a common ancestor, and everything comes from there. What Darwin didn't realize, though, is that the work of Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel and Darwin lived at the same time. Gregor Mendel was aware of Darwin's work, but Darwin was not aware of Gregor Mendel's work. And Gregor Mendel's work became lost for a while Darwin's work became popular. But Gregor Mendel described front-loaded information, where you can make changes over time based on information that's already there, that you don't have to come up with the information from scratch. So he showed how you can have, based on genetic crossover, you can make different kinds of peas from the same parent over and over and over again, very predictably. And it's based on genetic recombination, not based on you're recombining traits that already exist. It's like going to a bicycle shop and saying, I want that set of tires and that body and those handlebars. And then somebody else said, no, I would like those tires over there and those handlebars. But the options are already there on the wall. And you can just pick from them. That's what genetic recombination does. It doesn't create brand new stuff. It just recombines them in different ways to make different types of bikes. But your options are already there to pick from. And that's how you can make all the different kinds of dogs that are alive today in 300 years from the same common ancestor wolf. All the dogs that are and my friends say, you're not a creationist, John, you're a hyper-evolutionist. I was like, well, it actually happened. From the wolf, almost all the modern breeds of dogs were developed in 300 years, starting from the wolf. And so this can't be done by Darwinian evolution. It can only be done by Mendelian variation, largely speaking. So, there's other examples of this. There's some funny examples. Donkeys and horses make mules, but mules are sterile. Why are mules sterile? The reason why it's sterile is because when it does the recombination, the chromosome is flipped. It's inverted relative to the other one. And when it tries to recombine during meiosis, it makes a loop that fragments the chromosome. And so you lose information, and that makes the mule sterile. But the information is actually there, or you wouldn't have a mule. So it's the same common ancestor. It's just the bike parts got inverted upside down, right? And so that's why it stops with the mule. But the information didn't change. It just got the order of it changed. There's also lions and tigers make ligers. Polar bears and grizzly bears make pizzly bears. Horses and zebras make zorses. These are all real. I'm not joking. Ligers are bigger and stronger and live longer than lions or tigers. It's called hybrid vitality. This is a zebra and a horse, or I'm sorry, zebra and a donkey, called a zonkey. This is a peacock pheasant. This is a chickpea, a chicken and a peacock. This one barely survived. They had to try over and over to get this one. But it's a chirk, a chicken and a turkey, right? It looks a little bit draggled, didn't have hybrid vitality. This is a sheep and a goat, called a geep. And sheep and goats have different numbers of chromosomes, but the information is the same. It's just split up into different chunks of chromosomes. And so when they merge together, they can make viable offspring called geep, right? Of course, you don't want to be a geep when God separates the sheep from the goats. Right? Love that. Here's a baby geep. Here's a camel and a llama. And what's interesting about this is that camels and llamas live on different continents, right? And yet they still can come together and make viable offspring, which doesn't make sense from a Darwinian perspective, where these continents were separated by millions and millions of years of time. The Africa and South America supposedly split off 200 million years ago from each other. And of course, mammals supposedly evolved way after that, so there's the land bridges and things like that. But even the land bridges were many thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands, according to evolutionists, and yet they can still interbreed and produce viable offspring. And so it's more consistent with Noah's flood, where it only happened a few thousand years ago. Otherwise, they would have lost the ability to interbreed. Puma pard, panther and a puma. So you can go too far, but where do the hybrids stop? The hybrids for animals stop between orders and families. There are no interordinal animal hybrids. And so when the Bible talks about kinds, after its kind, these kinds are on the level of families, not orders. So if you had different orders, it would be different kinds. But each order then could make many different varieties within that order, starting with just two beginning parents, right? Because it would be a gene pool of pre-formed options. Of course, you could go too far with this. There's no jackalope. People used to tell me about these. I was searching for them when I was 12, but never found one. And then there's the peacock. So this is Darwin's tree. Those are jokes, yeah. So there's no real peacock, by the way. Darwin's tree of life doesn't really make sense from a Mendelian perspective. Mendelian perspective is more like the biblical perspective, where you have kinds that are limited, but can diversify within that kind. And you can make these trees that don't merge with the other trees. And each tree had a definitive starting point that you can't make the information from scratch. It's just too complex, it takes too much time. And you actually go downhill. This is an example of downhill evolution. Which fish came first? The one with eyes or the one without eyes? The one with eyes. Everything complex, highly complex, if you get two of them, the least complex one always came second. The more complex one always came first. Here's a flightless cormorant that lives on the Galapagos Islands that Darwin saw. Which came first? The flighted cormorant, or the one with stubby wings? The flighted one came first. The one that with stubby wings that can't fly, it lost its ability to fly because it's stuck on a windy island, and if it gets blown off to sea, it will die. All right? So it lost its ability. If you don't use it, you lose it. So what's also interesting is this paper that came out in 2018. A lot of modern stuff is starting to really make people question. Stockwell and Thayer discovered, doing genetic research on mitochondria, that almost all animal species alive on Earth today emerged at the same time as humans, which is very surprising from a Darwinian perspective. So the conclusion is very surprising. I fought against it as hard as I could because it suggests everything coming together, existing on the planet and showing up at the same time that's alive today sounds rather biblical. Of course, they said it happened 100,000 years ago based on mutational analysis between humans and chimps, right? But if you look at human pedigrees and chimp pedigrees for mitochondria and look at the actual mutation rates based on known pedigrees, known family relationships, the mutation rate's a lot higher than what's assumed between the assumed evolutionary relationship between humans and chimps. In fact, it's so much higher that it would shorten the time from 100,000 years for everything showing up at the same time to between 3,000 and 6,000 years ago, which is becoming very biblical, right? In fact, it's so biblical, no one talks about this since 2018. What's also funny is that if you look in the fossil record, things seem to be more similar to what the Bible describes things as being originally in the Garden of Eden, or at least in the New Earth. You know that more than half of fossil crocodiles were vegetarian? I don't know what they ate. They came out of the water and chomped on big watermelons. But we know this from their teeth. But more than half of them were vegetarians. And again, the vegetarian situation is more complex than meat eating. It takes less enzymes, less complex digestive system to be a meat eater than to be a vegetarian for animals and even humans. There's even some spiders that are currently vegetarian. If they catch some bug in their net, in their web, they trim it out and let it go. They only eat the pollen and other things that are vegetarian that fall into their web. So the Bible started to make a lot more sense when it says the lion will eat straw like an ox, right, and lay down with the lamb, and the wolf and the bear will feed together with the child will put their hand into a snake's hole and all these things. The Bible starts to make a lot more sense because, again, lions coming from a meat eating is the least complex. More complex is like cows, where you have like 4 stomachs and a bunch of extra enzymes. It's a lot more complicated to eat a vegetarian diet for an animal. But when you lose that and become a meat eater, and there's actually animals that started out vegetarian in known time, like parrots and some lizards and stuff like that started out vegetarian, but no vegetarian options were available in their environment, and they became meat eaters, and their gut system changed, and they became less complex. So we know this happens in real life. So why does this happen? It's like Humpty Dumpty. It happens, goes from complex to simple because it's so much easier to break something that's complex than it is to put it back together again. There's so many different ways to break it. There's only one way to put it back together again. This concept of sequence space. Sequence space contains everything, every permutation like of a 3-letter word, every possible different 3-letter sequence for the English language system. What is the total number? And as you look at meaning versus non-meaning for like the English language system, it's like stepping stones on the side of a pond where the stones are closer together at the edge of the pond. But as you walk out toward the middle of the pond, they get farther and farther apart in a linear way. And you start having to randomly swim for the next stone blindfolded. So I talked about this a little this morning, but the ratios change exponentially. 2-letter sequences, Scrabble English Dictionary, the ratio of defined versus not defined, meaningful versus not meaningful is 1 in 7. With 3-letter sequences, it's 1 in 18. Not so bad, but for 7-letter sequences, it goes up to 1 in 250,000, or down to 1 in 250,000. So you can see the exponential relationship. And it gets exponentially harder and harder and harder to find longer and longer meaningful beneficial sequences. And in fact, because of this, the detrimental mutation rate is so, again, like Humpty Dumpty, it's so much easier to break something than to make it back together again, that the detrimental mutation rate in the human population and in every animal population is so much higher than the beneficial mutation rate that we're all devolving. Every one of you have 100 mutations that your parents didn't have, right? 100 mutations. And probably more than 30 of them, there's some debate on this. It used to be thought that only 3 of them had any functional relevance. But now we know that a lot of the non-coding sequences are still functional in the human genome. Just because they don't code for protein doesn't mean they don't have function. And so the argument is that there's more like 20 or 30% of these things that have function in the human genome. And if you have 100 mutations, about 20 or 30% of them are going to be functional, have some functional effect, and almost all of those will be detrimental. And in order to keep up with the detrimental mutation load in each generation, the average woman, with just 3, let's just say there's 3 detrimental mutations in each generation, the average woman would have to give birth to 18 children for 2 of them to survive without mutations. How many women are doing your part? It's not like we guys aren't willing, you know. But the problem is that when you get up to 20 or 30 mutations that are detrimental, you're into the trillions of offspring to keep up with the detrimental mutation load. And so what that means is that humans are devolving over time. We're headed toward an eventual genetic meltdown and extinction. And we always have been since we left the Garden of Eden. We started out at a high level and we're devolving, not evolving. It's worse than neutral. It's not like I'm against evolution. It's the opposite of that. It's worse. We're devolving over time. That's what the evidence shows. And every animal is doing the same thing. And you can detect this over time. Because bacteria escape it because they reproduce fast enough to keep up. But humans and slowly reproducing animals and birds, reptiles, things like that, they don't reproduce fast enough to keep up. They're all going downhill. And all these different efforts to explain the downhill problem and how to modify that, they all end up going downhill. And people just stop talking about it. They can't explain it, so they stop talking about it. We're devolving. So still, this idea of getting something from nothing is very powerful in naturalistic scientific thinking. This guy is a brilliant guy, Michael Kiko. I'm going to show you a video clip, and he's going to describe how to get something from nothing. Truly nothing.
The universe could essentially be nothingness, which was unstable, and created a soap bubble.
The universe.
Now you may say to yourself, well, that can't be right, because that violates the conservation of matter and energy. How can you create a universe from nothing? Well, if you calculate the total matter of the universe, it is positive. If you calculate the total energy of the universe, it is negative because of gravity. Gravity has negative energy. When you add the two together, what do you get? 0. So it takes no energy to create a universe. Universes are for free. A universe is a free lunch. And then you may say to yourself, well, that can't be right, because positive and negative charges don't cancel out. Therefore, how can the universe be made out of nothing? Well, if you calculate the total amount of positive charge in the universe, and calculate the total amount of negative charge in the universe, and you add it up, what do you get? 0. The universe has 0 charge. Well, what about spin? Galaxies spin, right? But they spin in all directions. If you add up all the spins of the galaxies, what do you get? 0. So in other words, the universe has 0 spin, 0 charge, and 0 matter-energy content. In other words, the universe is for free.
So what do you do with that? Because everything he said there is correct, right? As far as we know. Everything he said there. So the universe is like nothingness that's turned into unstable somethingness. It's really bizarre way to think about it. But what he didn't explain is that the universe also has information. And where did the information come from? The precise ordering of the nothingness. Right? And the precision, we know the precision because we know the current entropy state of the universe. And entropy always goes one direction, downhill. Right? You get more and more higher levels of entropy, which means more and more disorder, mathematically speaking, or informationally speaking. And so in order to be where we are now, we had to start out somewhere superior in order for our battery to be where it is now. The battery's running out, so the battery had to be more charged to begin with than we are now. How specifically did the universe have to be at the beginning at the beginning of the Big Bang for us to be here now? Now, I believe in a Big Bang. I believe it looked like a Big Bang. Like you see those fireworks go off, boom, Big Bang, and then they spell out something or make a big face with a smiley thing or whatever, right? Well, it's very precise bang to make those smiley faces and letters spell out with these fireworks blowing off. It's a bang, but it's a very precise bang. And that's how the Big Bang happened, I believe, for our universe. It was a bang, it looked like a bang, but it's this extremely precise bang. And according to Roger Penrose, it was so precise that it was precision to one part in 10 to the power of 1 to the power of 123. Right? So 2 powers. So the precision of that is like 1 followed by 1 exponent 123 zeros. It's extreme precision. There's only 10 to the 80th atoms in the universe. Right? So that level of precision is like God would say, all right, this particular quark, I want you to go there, exactly there. And this one exactly there. And this one exactly there. And if it wasn't so precise, we wouldn't be here at all. So it's the informational complexity of the beginning of the bang that had to be there in order for us to be here, in order for us to have the sun burn and all these things happen and for life to exist. And that's what no one can explain. Where did the information come from to be so precise? Because most bangs are not precise, they're just random. A random bang would not have put us where we are now, because random bangs don't decrease entropy, they increase entropy. These observations imply that the early universe was in a very low entropic state, which shows that its initial conditions were extremely fine-tuned The reason for this fine-tunings are not explained by general relativity or the standard model. Adding inflation, where you flip gravity on its head, adding inflation to the model does not cure this fine-tuning problem. And this was known way back in 2005. And no one has addressed this problem ever. So where did the information come from? This is an illustration from Penrose's books where he shows God, I guess, pinpointing everything for the Big Bang. And he puts his number there in his book. So this is a little video clip illustrating what would happen. This is actually more likely than what would happen with how people describe the bang producing things by random. Like, last little tile goes in there. So how does somebody, let's say Richard Dawkins, let's give him a chance. How does he explain this?
I'm not so at ease with that as you seem to be, because it does seem to me that if there is a supernatural, superhuman intelligence that worked it all out, in a way that undermines the entire scientific enterprise, because we are, maybe an evolutionary biologist feels this more strongly, the whole enterprise of evolutionary biology is to explain how you get prodigious complexity and design from virtually nothing. I mean, we hand over to physicists when we can go beyond the virtually nothing to the absolutely nothing.
He's a physicist, by the way. So this is Brian Greene. He's a physicist doing this interview. So Dawkins goes on.
If the deistic God thought all that through and set up the laws of physics, then he would have to be damn clever. He would have to be a physicist to end all physicists. I don't care if he then withdraws. He needs an explanation in his own right. And it seems to me that the noble scientific enterprise is to start from as near nothing as you can get. Yeah.
So he says, if your God does not have an explanation, where did God come from, then you have no rational position. Yet they start with a quantum computer, and that's infinite and eternal. Where did your computer come from, right? And so, again, we're turtles all the way up or turtles all the way down. We all have conundrums that we can't explain. Where did God come from? Well, he's eternal, just like your quantum computer, right? And so I can't explain that. I can't wrap my mind around it. But that doesn't mean it's not true, you know? So Richard Dawkins, he says, although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And see, Paul's not very kind for it. He said, although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave him thanks. But they became futile in their thinking and darkened in their foolish hearts. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images of mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. So basically it boils down to judgment. Just don't call it God. We don't care if it's eternal, omnipotent, or anything. We just don't want it judging us, whatever it is. Right? And you don't think this is true, but it is. And sometimes these guys become honest when they're trapped into a corner. So here's an example. This is Lawrence Krauss. He wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing. It has an afterword by none other than Richard Dawkins, right? So, and basically saying the same thing. You make a bunch of universes and one of them is going to turn out right, starting with this quantum computer. So he's doing a radio interview with about this book, and with a man named Brierley, and he's talking about, in this radio interview, something very interesting, so I wrote it down. He said, maybe there is an eternally existing multiverse that we can't observe or test scientifically. Well, that's not science then, right? Maybe it has laws that we don't know about, which allow our universe to pop into being. Again, not science. Well, maybe this popping, all these maybes, Maybe this popping into being is uncaused. Who made God? Who made God? Who made your quantum computer that makes all these things pop? Religious people are stupid because they just assume brute facts. We're the only ones? Religious people are against the progress of science. They don't want to figure out how things work. But naturalists like me let the facts determine our beliefs. Philosophers are stupid too. They know nothing. I guess only physicists, right? So Brierly, then he's pretty good, this radio interviewer. Do you see any evidence for purpose in the universe? Krauss says, well, maybe I would believe if the stars lined up and spelled out a message from God. Like, hey, Lawrence, this is God stopping by to say hi, spell out a nice message for you. What would you do with that, Lawrence? And Brierly said, no, that would not do it for you. That would not be evidence for God from your multi-universe view. If there are an infinite number of universes existing for an infinite amount of time, then anything can happen no matter how unlikely it is. Therefore, no evidence could convince you that God exists, since the unobservable, untestable, eternal multiverse universe can make anything that it wants. So you shouldn't be surprised by 2-headed cows, or 10-headed cows, or Arnold Schwarzenegger winning the lottery 10 times in a row. Somewhere in the multi-universe, it's going to happen, right? This whole idea of enough universe, an infinite number of universes, undermines the very idea of science and testability. Because if anything can happen and nothing is a surprise, there's no falsifiability. It's bound to happen somewhere. That undermines the basis of scientific thinking in itself. It's self-contradictory. So they get themselves into a self-contradictory bind because they want to avoid one thing. So what does Lawrence Krauss do about this? He becomes honest. I was really surprised that he said this. He said, that's a true statement and very convenient for atheists who don't want to be accountable to God, don't you think? You talk about this God of love and everything else, but somehow, if you don't believe in him, you don't get any of the benefits. So you have to believe. And then, if you do anything wrong, you're going to get judged for it. I don't want to be judged by God. And that's the bottom line. Right? That's the bottom line. It has nothing to do with evidence. It has nothing to do with science. It has to do with not wanting to be judged, and that's the bottom line. Right? And so he gets stuck in the corner. What are you going to do about this? The problem is that we Christians are in the same boat. Who wants to be judged? No one wants to be judged. But what does the Bible say about Christians and judgment? This is a really thing. Judgment is given in favor of the saints. Right? So, who's a saint? Right? There's a couple hands. Does the Bible let's say David. Was David a saint? The most saintly guy to ever walk the planet? David was the most wormy guy. One of the most. He was horrible. He was a murderer. Not just one person. He did a lot of bad things. It took an adulterer, murderer, and just on and on. And you read through it, and then he's a man after God's own heart. Why? Because he's a murderer? No, because he kept admitting that he was wrong and that he needed help. Right? Created me a new heart. Right? Make me a metamorphosis. Because I can't do it myself. I'm a terrible person. Right? As soon as you come to God and say, God, I cannot do it. You're going to have to do it. Please do it. Right? As soon as you do that, you are a saint. Right? Because what is the whole basis of the Reformation, Protestant Reformation? Basically, God comes and says to that little horn that says, you have to do it yourself. The little horn speaks great things against the Most High, and God says, shut up. I'm going to do it. Right? These people don't have to do it. That's the Protestant Reformation. It said, the just shall live by doing it all themselves. No, the just shall live by faith where God does everything. You can't do it. You cannot turn your wormy self into a butterfly. You're just going to be stuck as a wormy self unless somebody else creates the new heart within you. Right? It's only then that you'll be able to fly. Right? Without some help, you're stuck. We're all stuck. We're just like Lawrence Krauss. We're stuck under judgment. It's only that Jesus took judgment for us. Right? And liberated us on the cross and made a way. And then said, look, I took it over for you. Now I can create a new heart for you guys. And so this is what's hopeful about the Christian message, is that we're all in the same boat, but the boat that we're in is going the right place, right? So from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subject to violence, and violent people have been raiding it, Matthew 11:12. And I used to wonder about this when I was a kid, but if you read the commentaries on it, even Ellen White talks about this a little while, it gives out a whole new perspective. In other words, they're not just violent, they're desperate. Who is desperate to get to heaven here? Right? How desperate are you? Are you willing to do anything? Give up everything for the pearl of great price? You know, the pearl of great price works both ways. Jesus thought that we were the pearl of great price and gave up everything, right? We also should consider as Christians that He's the pearl of great price and give up everything, right? How much are you willing to give up? How violent are you willing to separate yourself from whatever is attaching you to this planet? Desperate sinners who were under the violent apprehensions of wrath and vengeance of their lost and undone state and condition by nature were violently in love with Christ and eagerly desirous of salvation by Him and communion with Him, and had their affections set upon the things of another world, these having the gospel preached to them, which is a declaration of God's love to sinners, a proclamation of peace and pardon, and a publication of righteousness of the life by Christ, they greedily catched onto it and embraced it. Is it okay to be greedy for the love of God? Sometimes it's okay to be greedy, guys. Take a hold of it. It's offered to you. Grab it and don't let go. Grab God's hand and He will create the new heart within you. You just have to, basically, it's so much in favor of you that all you have to do is not block the door, right? If you just get out of the way, God's going to take over. You have to actively resist to actually not make it. If you just give in and surrender, God will take over.